¿Hoy?
¿Esta noche?
No lo vi. No. Perdón.
Ponéselo cuando termine.
Bueno, si les parece, vamos a empezar la última sesión del día, que con la conferencia plenaria de...
Pablo, prende tu cámara para aparecer.
Fijaste la inspiración. No, igual no para ahí. Bueno, como decía, vamos a empezar la última sesión con la conferencia plenaria de Liliana Sánchez. Liliana, bueno, para quienes no la conocen, es una gran investigadora y docente, es profesora en la Universidad de Illinois, Chicago, y tiene una larga trayectoria en investigación, por supuesto en gramática del español, en el contacto de lenguas, ¿no? En particular el contacto del español con lenguas originarias, el estudio de bilingüismo, ¿no? Ha escrito muchos trabajos sobre...
Hablarle a la cámara.
Ha escrito muchos trabajos sobre alfabetización, en segundas lenguas, tiene 3 libros publicados, ¿no, Liliana? 3 libros publicados, 2 sobre bilingüismo español y quechua, y una gramática del quechua, ¿no? Sobre la morfología y la sintaxis del quechua, en particular en relación con la cultura. Y debo decir que aparte de sus estudios teóricos, también tiene una importante dedicación, ¿no? Para la comunidad, por decirlo de alguna manera, una militancia, ¿no? En trabajar en los problemas asociados con el bilingüismo. Tiene 2 proyectos. Uno es el Bilinguism Lab, y además un proyecto que fue desarrollado en la época de la pandemia de cómo se comunicaba la comunicación en las comunidades de Perú, en particular creo que de la Amazonia, ¿no? De la parte de la Amazonia.
Sí, hablar de quechua y shipibo.
De acá, sí, y de quechua y shipibo, perdón, sobre la comunicación de la información, sobre el COVID y bueno, la verdad muchas gracias Liliana, es un honor que para nosotros se pueda participar y no sé, queríamos invitarte este año en particular porque la idea era del encuentro en particular era orientar a la discusión sobre lenguas originarias y bilingüismo. Así que te agradezco y los dejo con ustedes. La ponencia que va a presentar, la conferencia es Audiability, Data Status, Technical Frequency and Differential Access and Transient Time.
Muchas gracias, Pablo, por la presentación y gracias a los organizadores por la invitación y al público también. Voy a presentar en inglés. Bueno, creo que todo el mundo pueda escuchar y también les quiero comentar que yo no lo puedo ver, pero Pablo me va a indicar si hay algo que necesito ver o que necesito detener en la presentación o si alguien tiene alguna pregunta o un comentario o pasa algo con la presentación. Muchas gracias otra vez por la invitación y empiezo ya. El título de mi presentación, the title of my presentation is Variability Inherited Syntax, Lexical Frequency, Differential Access, and Transient Alignments. So today I'm going to be talking to you all, here's an outline of the talk about the challenges of formalizing syntactic properties in heritage grammar. Because of 2 important concepts, divergence part of the central aspect of the work that has been done in heritage grammars. I will be also talking about lexical frequency effects, giving examples from studies on gender and subjunctive in heritage Spanish spoken in the United States. And I will be talking about differential access based on previous work that some colleagues and I have done on what happens to subjunctive among heritage speakers of Spanish in the United States. Basically, people who grew up in the United States are exposed to Spanish since early childhood, or are speakers of Spanish from birth, but then become dominant in English. And after that, I will be presenting on bilingual alignments, which is a proposal I made to try to account for these level of variability that we find among heritage speakers. And finally, I'm going to be talking about the continuum for bilingual alignments to stable integrated lexical units and the need for a dynamic approach to syntax rather than a static approach to syntax. Okay. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the shift in input and interaction among heritage speakers. As noted by Control, Floyd, and many others in the past, heritage language development is characterized by a very specific position set. In particular, some particular input conditions, namely a more intensive exposure to their language in early years. That's what happens to the heritage speaker. So let's say you're a speaker of Spanish, you're at home, you are in constant interaction in Spanish with your parents or your guardians. And this tends to happen after age 3 or 4. And then there's a significant shift of input toward the majority language in society in later years, for example, to English. So after the ages of 4 or 5, and usually coincides with school attendance, then the level of input you received in Spanish becomes, minimized, and there's a way more intensive and more frequent interaction and input in English. And so that shapes your use of Spanish in many ways. So heritage speakers have been described as, in 2 ways. Many studies in the past focused on divergence. So many studies focus on how the production and the judgments of heritage speakers differ from baseline of comparison, meaning the first generation immigrant English speakers. So how do heritage speakers differ from the people from whom they received input and with whom they interact in Spanish? That's one type of, one line of studies. And there's another line of studies that focuses on variability. And that is the aspect, that we're going to be focusing on today. And that is that heritage speakers may alternate between, some people think, are 2 or more grammatical variants in a given linguistic context. For instance, Cortez 2020 reports that heritage speakers of Spanish produced both subjunctive and indicative mood morphology after these narrative constructions. For instance, constructions like querer que, which usually that show that variability applies in different domains in the syntax, but also across morphology and phonology, which I will not mention or again in this slide. So the big question that has been part of the field of studies of heritage studies has been what causes speakers to exhibit variability. So there have been many accounts. There's some that I'm making here, the input-based accounts, such as Mutlu's approach of incomplete acquisition or mastery. So these heritage speakers do not complete the process of acquisition of a heritage language because there's a big shift in input. There's also proposals that have been made about variability in the input. For instance, work by Peterson Rothman and Rothman. And this was work that was done with British speakers of Brazilian Portuguese, right, in which some forms that are not used orally but only learned in written form are not acquired by the heritage speakers of Brazilian Portuguese because they do not have access to formal instruction in the language. So that also creates variability in the input. And a proposal by Flores and Barbosa that there is delayed acquisition due to reduced input too. So it's sort of like it's not incomplete, but it takes longer and sometimes we don't see the same development that we see in speakers who are monolingual or who are dominant in a particular language. Another series of accounts are those of the reconfiguration of the grammar. So there's reduced activation of the language, and there's feature reassembly. So there's changes in the way in which features are specified. There's reanalysis in adult heritage speakers. That's the work by Polinsky, traditional work by Polinsky. And then there are some proposals about multiple grammars and restructuring. So there's restructuring, but there's also the possibility to have access to multiple grammars. So in a way, the heritage speaker has access to more than one grammar. In the case of the example I gave before about to want that requires a subordinate with a subjunctive mood, this would be a case in which the speaker can access both instruction with subjunctive and one with indicative. So, moving to account for variability, I will be talking about this type of reanalysis that has been proposed, right? That speakers sort of like, heritage speakers sort of like can reanalyze based on the information that they get from the heritage language, but also from the from the majority language in society, the one in which they become dominant. And I will talk about three aspects, of course there are many more, that might be of relevance for us to understand why there is variability in heritage grammar. The first one is lexical frequency, and I will present lexical frequency effects and will present some examples from gender and subjunctive, as I said before. Differential access, meaning that we can see that the heritage speaker might look as though they are at different levels in production and interpretation. I mean, the same speaker. We will see this in speakers who are dominant in a language or monolingual because their production usually matches their interpretation. But what we do see with heritage speakers is their production does not always include interpretation. And some of you would think, yeah, that happens in second language acquisition too. But the interesting part, the interesting aspect of this is happening to a native speaker of a language. And finally, I will present my idea about bilingual alignment. Some of you have probably heard it before, but we can certainly go deeper in the question and answer section. So let me talk first about lexical frequency effects. In previous work with Court and Lopez Otero, we found lexical frequency effects in nouns. And I'll show you a bit of an example of what we did. We explored what happened with nouns with canonical ending, that is the a, o, where a indicates feminine and o indicates masculine. But we also looked at nouns with non-canonical endings. So nouns ending in e, masculine voce or feminine torre, and consonant ending, masculine papel and feminine miel. And the non-canonical where the relationship between a and o is just the opposite, as in the canonical case, sistema masculine, mando feminine, right? Okay, and we had both a productive task and a receptive task, in which we, asked the participants to, in the oral production task, to respond to the question, what type of rice do they eat in the countryside? In this example, rice is masculine and it's non-canonical, right? And the participants would actually see a picture of rice, right? And they would also see, and there were training items. They would see a square with a color, and they will match the noun with the color, and the color would be an adjective, right? So we expected in oral production for them to respond in Spanish, blanco, so white masculine. Because if they did, if they were able to recognize, right, they would give us blanco as this is the gender that price is assigned. Then, when we looked at the receptive task, we gave them a first choice task, and they would also get the question, what type of rice do they eat in the countryside, and we expected them to say the rice white, masculine, blanco or blanco. And we didn't expect them to say rice white feminine. And here's what we found. And this is, for us, it was very interesting. And let me also explain a little bit what we have on the x-axis. We also gave the speakers a task in which they self-reported how frequent did the word sound to them. Because we had originally assumed or taken from the Davis corpus the frequency of the nouns that we use. Some were, according to the Davis, corpus, they were considered frequent and some were considered infrequent. But we know that for Kurdic speakers, the frequency might be different because they speak home language most of the time. So here we see the self-lexical rating frequency, right? The lexical count and accuracy in gender assigned in agreement according to several of the variables that we looked at. And I want to point you to the green line on the production task, which is the most, the one that is most notable. So here we see that according to the speaker's own perception of the word where, the percentage of accurate responses increased when we have non-canonical feminine. So, does frequency help? Yes, it does, but it does mostly with non-canonical feminine nouns in production, right? So we see this is what happens in production. Curiously enough, the opposite is true for the canonical feminine. That is an odd fact that we found. But this is production, right? Where we see this significant, relevance of lexical frequency for non-canonical feminine forms. Now, with the first choice task, we don't see such a difference, right? We see that indeed non-canonical masculine, right, is also supported to a certain extent by frequency. But the most important frequency effect that we found in production and not in the first choice task. However, we do find some effect in non-canonical masculine. Okay, so I'm sorry. Okay, so that's for nouns, right? Now let's look a little bit at verbs. So is there a lexical frequency effect on subjunctive in verbs? Well, I'm going to refer us now to page 21. We conducted a study in which she looked at indicative reports, with cases where indicative reports an assertion, the same verb, and this is a reported assertion context. Here we have, el jefe les dice a los empleados que trabajan bien. So this is reporting an assertion. In this case, the verb to say is being used to report an assertion. And therefore we have indicative on the verb. But it is also possible to have subjunctive as a way of reporting a command, akin to the verb tell in English. And this is a juicy context, right? So here we have the sentence, el jefe les dice a los empleados que trabajen bien, right? So now we have a juicy context, so it's a way of, indicating a command. And what this test did is that she tested participants with the distinction between assertions and commands embedded here highly frequent verbs like decir, and embedded under low frequency verbs like repetir. And again, these are low frequency according to the in relationship. I mean, repetir is low frequency in relationship to decir, not in absolute terms. Okay. So here we see the differences between the sentences with repetir and decir, right? So what she used was a true value judgment task, and here is the true value judgment task participants mean accuracy as a function of matrix variable rule. So basically, she gave them a context. She used either the assertion sentence or the command sentence, and the participants have to say whether in that context the sentence was true or false. What we see here is that on the left, right, with the decir, right, the participants' judgments do not differ too much across individuals. But when we have a relatively low frequency main verb determining what happens in the subordinate, right, we see here that there is difference, right? The results for some of these individuals are very different in terms of the mean score, right? Here, someone who indicative is at 50% at chance level, but way beyond 50% with subjunctive, right? And here we see another individual too that has a huge difference, and another here, here, where you can see that there's a huge difference. So at the level of individual variation, we see that this is closer, right? Both indicative and subjunctive are closer in most of these individuals, but here there's huge difference between having a high frequency and a low frequency matrix verb that would condition the use of indicative and conjunctive, and so there's in a true value judgment task. So this is an interpretive task. This is not a production task. Okay. So I will now introduce us to another concept, but basically having shown that indeed there is an effect of lexical frequency that can be shown in the syntax of the speakers of heritage. I'm not talking about dominant speakers or heritage speakers. So then there is the concept of differential taxes. In previous work, Pérez Cortés and I worked on what we think is, a phenomenon that we find among heritage speakers, which is what we call or term differential access to representations in production versus interpretation. So we looked at Spanish subjunctive in obligatory context, so we're supposed to say Spanish in most varieties of Spanish in speakers who are not in contact with other languages and who are dominant. Juan quiere que hable, right, menos. That is what is to be grammatical, and not that means the subjunctive form, not indicative form. Kemczynski in 2009 proposed that this was the case because actually the subjunctive mood is the spell out of an operator that introduces possible words, right? So you cannot have Juan quiere que hable menos where there is some kind of a pro here that is that does not refer to that refers back to that it must refer to a different it must have a different referent than one. Whereas we have control structures in B, if you don't have anything or the copy is deleted or however you want to analyze it, then it's basically one. It's the same in the subordinate as it is in the main clause. So that's a huge distinction for speakers of Spanish, right? We have foliation effects with subjunctive and we don't have foliation effects with the control structure. Okay. So it's not a picture-based or a distinction task. And we check by the disjoint reference condition, right? So in this context, right, we expect, disjoint reference. So the context is as follows: SpongeBob and Pick are planning to travel to Hawaii, but Bob wants his friend to visit the island before him. So we're expecting Bob Esponja quiere que Patrick viaje a Hawaii antes que él, or Bob Esponja quiere que su amigo viaje a Hawaii antes que él, or many other possibilities, but definitely not viaja, right, in indicative. We're expecting viaje in subjunctive, right? And we're also not expecting in this particular context, we're not expecting the infinitival form, because if the person, were to Gómez Monja quiere viajar a Hawái antes que él, then it will be a referential or infrastructure, as we said. So we had a true value judgment condition. This was interpretation, and here is example of the disjointment condition. Dora says, I am tired and I'm going home, but you can stay and play a bit more. Wood says, okay, thanks Dora, right? And then we expect Dora quiere que siga jugando, right? That's again Woods, right? But we don't expect for them to say Dora wants to continue playing, right? Dora quiere seguir jugando, Dora quiere que ella siga jugando. Okay. So these are the results for the interpretation and the production tasks into proficiency. And at this point, we had the participants separated in different groups, right? We had them separated into controls, actually the comparison group of baseline speaker. So first generation immigrants to the United States who are speakers of Spanish. We had advanced level heritage speakers, intermediate level heritage speakers, and low level heritage speakers. This proficiency was measured using the daily. We don't do that now, but at that time we did so. What we found was that, and these are two things I would like to point out to you, right? At the low level of proficiency, we see a huge gap between the interpretation of the subjunctive and in production. So basically, the heritage speaker at 60, the heritage speakers on average is studied 64.4%, were not utterly confused when their mother said to them about one of the brothers, quiero que vaya a la tienda, right? I want for him to go to the store. It's not that they couldn't interpret it, at least they were a little bit above chance level, but they never produced it. Right? So they don't know how to produce the zone reference, or they produce something different. And notice that this also affects, to some extent, the intermediate heritage speakers, right? Not the advanced one, although they differ somewhat slightly from the difference. I'm sorry, is someone say something?
No.
No? Okay. Should I continue?
Yes, please.
Okay, good. So in terms of, when we have the referential context, right, we see the opposite pattern with the low proficiency heritage speakers, right? They do produce them, 81.3%, but they seem to be confused with respect to the interpretation, at least on average, 54.4%. So what does this tell us? This tells us that heritage speakers, especially at the lower levels of proficiency, have a difference, like a huge difference between what they can do in interpretation and what they can do in production, right? With this joint reference and with co-reference reference. Okay, so there's a greater proficiency effect in the production, and also there's more of an effect in the production, right? Either towards the positive, like they produce them more or less. And this is not surprising given that something like this is found in English and no form of subjunctive is found in those contexts in English. So furthermore, we also apply some categorization that Putnam and Sanchez provided at some point to try to understand why is there this mismatch in interpretation and production, right? And here we see that speakers that may be within the same proficiency range may be at different stages in interpretation and production. Just to give you an example, here at the low level, here we have one participant that is ranked at stage 2. Basically, they had about a 50% chance of being able to interpret. Whereas in terms of production, we found that this person produced querer plus infinitive 60% of the time. I mean, they have this new form, querer plus infinitive. And we also have a 40% of control structure, right? So it is like a big shift or a big difference. And here I would like to point out also somebody who's at stage 2 in terms of interpretation with the true value judgment task. And in production, right, we see that having control 80% and 20% of querer plus indicative. So as you can see, subjunctive is not present anymore in production with these two individuals. Right? However, it's not as though they are fully unable to understand the disjoint and reference and conjunctive reference. Okay. So when people talk about have been asking for a long time why do heritage speakers show L2 property instead of L1 properties with low frequency lexical items. And also, why is it more difficult for heritage speakers to access the L1 properties for production purposes than for interpretation purposes? Or in some cases, they exhibit chance that results in interpretation tasks where they are able to produce a target-like lexical item. So all of these questions about variability need an answer, and in the past I have attempted to provide one because the traditional answer is, oh, there's transfer from the L2 to the L1 due to difficulty suppressing the L2 representation. In fact, yes, one could say it's very hard when you're documenting English to suppress the representations that you have in English, and they start popping up in your Spanish, right? But if transfer occurs from one language to another, why is transfer so variable in heritage speakers, right? Why does it show variability? And that is the big question. So in 2019, and in work with David and Pastor in 2021, we proposed that speaker access units composed of features from different language components, phonological form, morphology, syntax, and semantics, that are linked and stored in the speaker's memory in order to facilitate their production and comprehension of language. So here we are attempting to talk about something that is in between what people used to call the dichotomy between, performance and competence, right? So if we assume that there are transition storage units, that this allows us to understand the permeability of features, even in cases when people talk about bidirectional transfer, something from the L1 goes into the L2, something from the L2 goes into the L1. And this is important because this will allow us to avoid having to assume multiple competing grammatical representations. So if a bilingual speaker's alignments are permeable, features in a bilingual language A alignment can bleed into an alignment of theirs from language B. And this might help us to understand why bilingual speakers, in particular speakers, exhibit apparent transfer from language A to language B by using features of language A and language B with property X. But then they maintain systematic knowledge of property X in language B, mostly producing auto-comprehending in the target-like manner. So the idea is there is this thing that we think is a transient, that can stable, a transient state in which we can see that features from one language and bleeding to the other, that there's not a single direction. They can go in both ways, and these storage units are some way in which the speaker allows for access, for production, for interpretation, and you might have different alignments or storage units that you have access to. And I'll explain this with an example of the study that we did on inalienable possession in Spanish, in particular structure 2, which we see in 8A, me rompí el brazo, I broke my arm. Crucial here we have a clitic with third person singular, and we have a definite determinant, right? And so Spanish requires person features expressed by a pronoun. For alienable arguments, no clitic pronoun and no person features are required, so rompí el espejo. And here the crucial distinction is that when you have an inalienable item, something that is part of your body, and there's many other definitions for inalienable possession, but it's clear here that el espejo is not inalienable in the sense that it's external to the speaker, right? And we rarely find in non-bilingual or non-heritage speech, we rarely find things like me rompí el espejo. And notice this is different from the one where we have like a benefactory or affected subject, right? So this is different. Okay. So inalienable possession in English works differently, right? You say I broke my arm, so the person features are on the subject, but are also on the determiner, and it's not possible to have a definite. And for alienable arguments, no person marking is required within this TP, right? You get I broke the mirror. You can say I broke my mirror, right? But it doesn't mean that it is inalienable. So in order to account for what happens in Spanish, we followed an adaptation of Cuervo's 2003 analysis of dative possessors, in particular structures like Pablo de Valeria la hija, right? And so we assume that in this construction, there's an applicative projection, right? And we see that the head of the applicative projection is the eclectic lead, right? And then we have two arguments or terms for this applicative head. So we extend this, applicative projection analysis to inalienable possession, right? We could think of Merovina mano as a structure where we actually have the eclectic as the head, right? And then we have the la mano as some, the complement to the eclectic head, and then we have, me somewhere high up there. So in an inalienable structure, the applicative is headed by personal features. There's a complement, and then he has right? So the fact that English and Spanish differ in the expression of possession offers the opportunity to examine potential variability and cross-linguistic influence in heritage language acquisition. So we have in English, I brought my arm, as I said before, and in Spanish, in most varieties of Spanish, me rompí el brazo. This will mean that in English we don't find the applicative, we just have the personal features in B, whereas in Spanish, in English, and in Spanish we find the applicative projection and the B features in the DP, right? And so let's look at variability. So we assume that this is the case. We're looking at what the alignments, so the features that make up each of these lexical units are. So we're going to look at their alignment. We wrote in English, we see some features. Of course, there might be more. This is just for an example. And in the determiner alignment, we usually see, in mind, we see first person, right? Possessive expression. But if we look at the determiner alignment, what's missing here for the determiner alignment in Spanish is, even though some people might even argue that this is a person, that this can be marked for person, it's very definite, singular, and masculine, but it does not have any possessive meaning to the extent that we don't assign it to it, right? And whereas we see this possessive or person, agreement for some sort of person feature in the eclectic and in the verb, right? So, bilingual alignments with person features on D, right, can be permeable to the English alignment, right? And this is what we're saying here, that we can think of a situation in which we assume that the bilingual speaker has, access to two different determiner alignments. Then suddenly you can see possessors in forms like mi brazo, right? That are sort of similar to what we find in English, and forms even in which there is the possibility of having the eclectic me, and also having the determinant alignment, in which we will find me rompí mi brazo, right? That's a possibility too. So the possible outcomes that we see here are, we can have the eclectic plus the definite determinant, which will be like the target-like structure, me rompí el brazo, right? No possessor person features on D. But we can also have different possible innovations that are conceivable in this context, in which variability is possible because some features from one alignment go to the other. So we have rompí mi brazo, and rompí el brazo. So all of these, in principle, should be possible. So we conducted this study with some research questions regarding the variability in the production and acceptance of alignments for inalienable possession. And to try to look why does variability look the way it does, right? And whether it's more pronounced for Spanish heritage speakers than for Spanish dominant bilinguals, and whether variability with inalienable possession alignments is motivated by Spanish proficiency and task modality. And actually, we were also very interested in knowing whether the heritage speakers were sensitive to object type when projecting the applicative phrase. So, meaning, do they distinguish between alienable and inalienable possessions, however they express inalienable possession? And that was kind of what we did. These are our participants, the Spanish dominant control, are 15, the advanced heritage speakers 16, and the intermediate heritage speakers 14. Their age of acquisition is here, so of course for English, right, is between birth and age 6 for the advanced heritage speakers and for the intermediates. And you see their daily proficiency scores there. Okay, ¿sí?
10 minutos, digo, porque no me ves.
Dime.
10 minutos te quedan.
find it is just, look at this picture, tell me what you see, and there were, of course, training sessions. And, I'm sorry, yes, this is the production task. And here you see the frequencies with undeniable objects, like for instance, this is arm, right? And you see that indeed, across the controls, the critic plus definite determiner is the most common, but with the intermediate heritage speakers, then we see a difference. We see no critic and a possessive determiner, right? So this is like the English, like Robin class, right? But you can see that the frequencies with undeniable objects with mirror, right, are incredibly consistent, no critic and definite determiner, right? Even for the intermediate heritage speaker. So there is a sensitivity in production to distinguishing between inalienable and alienable objects, but that necessarily doesn't mean that there's no difficulty with production of the critics, right? But here we see the huge difference between inalienable and alienable, right? If we have an alienable, like using the critic is really zero, right? Skip this. So the probability of producing a possessive determiner grows higher for the intermediate level heritage. So they do have way more possessive than the other groups, right? And so, but at the same time, we see that the intermediate heritage speakers have much more variability. They produce more possessive determiners than the controls and then the advanced ones. But the proficiency does modulate that. So there are somewhere in intermediate level. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the acceptability judgment task in forms like memoria de la lengua, right? And here you see that, for inalienable objects, it's funny because even for the controls, critic plus possessive memoria de lengua is possible, or memoria de lengua is also possible in terms of acceptance, right? And the acceptance lowers a little bit for the memoria de la lengua, right? Lowers for intermediate heritage speakers. But everyone is very accepting, and this is unlike what we saw in the production. And the same way, here in intermediate heritage speakers are more accepting of a critic plus definite determiner is something like el espejo, right? Okay, so this is inalienable objects. Curiously also, acceptance grows for intermediate heritage speakers, and this is the acceptance of the critic plus the definite determinant for the alienable, and it would be weird because some of them accept. So I'm going to skip these to make time for my discussion, right? So what we see is that heritage speakers make the same distinction as the controls, and yet at the same time they produce pretty innovative variants of inalienable possession. The first variant, Robin brazo, arises when the critic alignment and the determinant alignment have possessor person features. The second variant, Robin brazo, arises when there is no applicative projection and the determinant alignment has possessor person features. And there's even a third variant, Robin brazo, when there's neither applicative phrase nor possessor features in the determinant alignment. So because bilingual alignments are not necessarily representational, the fact that a heritage speaker produces one or more of these innovations, that doesn't necessarily imply that they have a divergent grammar. And that's the point that I wanted to make, right? We can go from transient alignments that are used for processing, in production, and interpretation, to what becomes stable integrated lexical units, right? So, are these performance issues? If so, why should they matter, right? And we could say that indeed, there's a continuum that goes from, stable alignments, as the ones that monolinguals or dominant speakers have, to having multiple alignments, that depend on the frequency of the lexical item, or on how their access for production or for interpretation, to actually accessing almost only the alignments that do not have the heritage language values, and then yield to a restructuring of the native grammar. So, heritage speakers do show lexical frequency effects, differential access to grammatical representations through the selection of different alignments in each home. And more levels of proficiency, their production reveals access to English-like bilingual alignments. In receptive tasks, they are able to access multiple alignments, which start revealing wider acceptance structures. And now, finally, a coming attraction. How do we capture access to multiple alignments with barriers varying degrees of stability. So Roberto D'Alessandro, my colleague, and I are currently working on what we need, which is a dynamic model of syntax. That is, a model of syntax that allows us to have context in which a particular representation can be selected, and this can change according to context. And by context, we do not mean pragmatic context, we mean levels of proficiency, we mean lexical frequency, we mean a lot of the factors that I've been talking about now. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Bueno, tenemos 10 minutos para preguntas. No más, 7 minutos. Bueno, ¿preguntas? Bueno, yo tengo algunas preguntas para empezar. Con respecto a esta idea de teorías y competencias para la lengua, diferencias, ¿no? Entre las de tipo relacionadas con el input para la estructuración, ¿no? Esto cómo aparece en las variedades de contacto, cómo influye o cómo puede influir esta decisión, por ejemplo, para las variedades de contacto.
Para la variedad de contacto también, ¿no es cierto? Es decir, cuando yo hablo de los alineamientos bilingües, por eso no son solo para los hablantes de herencia, es también en variedades de contacto. Por ejemplo, una persona, cuando nosotros estudiamos variedades de contacto, ¿te puedo dar la respuesta en inglés donde salió en español? ¿Está bien si la doy en español o should I switch back to English?
Sí, en español está bien.
Ok, entonces, sí, para toda persona bilingüe que empieza a ser más o menos dominante en una de las dos lenguas, porque el mito es que las personas bilingües son igualmente dominantes en las dos lenguas, ya está, ¿no? Sobrepasado, nadie lo piensa así, pero creo que lo que sí es importante entender es que en los contextos de contacto, justamente eso es lo que ocurre. Entonces también las personas que viven en contextos de contacto exhiben mucha variabilidad, ¿no? Entonces, por ejemplo, depende de con quién están hablando, depende del acceso al léxico, depende de muchas cosas. En el español latino de contacto, en el Perú, por ejemplo, tienen personas que pueden decir cosas como, doctor, usted vas a comer más tarde, a mí me dicen, doctorito, usted vas a comer más tarde, ¿no? Y pueden a veces tener, por ejemplo, el quechua tiene orden canónico, sujeto, objeto, verbo. Entonces, en algunos momentos se escucha uno sujeto, objeto, verbo, como respuesta a una pregunta, ¿no? General, ¿no? General. Y en otros momentos escuchas SDO, del mismo hablante, o de la misma hablante, ¿no? Entonces, muchas veces la gente dice, bueno, esto normalmente era el terreno de la sociolingüística, ¿no? Es decir, aquí tenemos variedades y vamos a encontrar una variable social que fije, ¿no? Porque es que a veces hay SOB, con quien habla, con quien no habla. Y bien, genial, pero desde una perspectiva de sintaxis formal, igual tenemos que dar cuenta de eso, ¿no? Es decir, estas personas tienen acceso, al parecer, a lo que algunas personas piensan son gramáticas múltiples, pero lo que nosotros queremos decir es no, de pronto no tienen siempre acceso a gramáticas múltiples, porque no es que haya múltiples representaciones gramaticales, es que en el proceso, cuando están procesando el lenguaje para producción y para interpretación, es como usar ese tiempo fuera, ¿no? Busquemos los rangos relevantes que hay que obtener. Entonces, algunas veces vamos a encontrar personas que tienen como crítico de objeto directo lee, y de pronto pues les sale un no online. Y uno dice, ¿está o no está? Y está pero está muy poquito. Y suele estar cuando hay tiempo para procesar. Pero cuando no hay tiempo para procesar, se va uno al tipo, ¿no? Y dice, bueno, con lee, me planteo que con lee tengo masculino, femenino y todo. Pero eso no quiere decir que no haya empezado a establecerse el rango de género. Y empieza con algunos ítems léxicos y, como han dicho siempre, algunos tipólogos y sociolingüistas se va extendiendo después al resto del léxico o no, o se queda en una lista de léxico. Entonces, ¿Cómo formalizamos eso? La presentación que les di hoy era un intento de tratar de entender que hay un continuo, que no, esa dicotomía que nosotros teníamos entre performance y encarnación y competencia, ¿no? Es una dicotomía demasiado fuerte que los hablantes bilingües y los de herencia no cuestionan, porque están siempre a medio camino entre efectos de frecuencia, efectos de procesamiento y cómo se van consolidando sus representaciones de acuerdo a los intermediarios. Sé que de una perspectiva de cuestiones abstractas no estoy negando la existencia de que haya una sintaxis autónoma, independiente, no es eso lo que estoy diciendo. Lo que estoy diciendo es que en la práctica, en la vida real, cuando hablamos y procesamos, la sintaxis viene paquetada con otras cosas, no viene solita. Y entonces, al tener que acceder en nuestra mente a estas matrices compuestas por todo esto, se puede ir, el efecto de la frecuencia léxica puede ir afectando cómo se va estabilizando esta matriz, ¿no?, de elementos de varios módulos del lenguaje, al punto que empezamos a observar un cambio. Y ese cambio puede ser temporal, ¿no?, por cuestión de producción o de interpretación, o puede establecerse y ya ser una reestructuración gramatical cuando se encuentra la mayor parte de las veces y no cuando es variable. Por eso a mí me parece que es muy difícil hablar de reestructuración cuando el hablante todavía tiene un alto nivel de variabilidad, tanto en su interpretación como en su producción. O incluso cuando tiene tanta diferencia entre su interpretación y su producción. La punto que el hablante te dice, yo que sí entiendo la referencia disjunta, a mi mamá, pero yo así no la produzco, ya no produzco su.
Perfecto. ¿Hay una pregunta de Andrés?
Sí, claro.
Hola Liliana, ¿me escuchás?
Andrés, si te acercas más al micrófono, por favor.
Acabo de romper la computadora.
Hola Liliana, ¿me
¿Ya
escuchás?
lo lleva?
No.
No me pongas
No. Está apagado.
Hola, hola.
Hola Andrés.
¿Cómo estás Liliana? ¿Todo bien?
Bien, bien, escucharte.
Igualmente, hace tanto tiempo. Soy absolutamente ignorante respecto a estas cuestiones, así que mi pregunta es más que nada una cuestión de si estoy diciendo una estupidez, decirlo con total confianza, porque nos conocemos hace mucho.
Perdón, ¿me puedo pedir a Pablo que me repita tu pregunta porque no te estoy escuchando?
A ver, voy acá. Hola, ¿ahí me escuchas mejor?
Sí, ahora sí.
Quiero preguntar esto. A mí estas cuestiones de la, quizás sea un poco conservador, esta cuestión de mezclar la performance y la competencia, hacerlas interactuar de esta manera, me complica un poco. Pero y también esto de las gramáticas, de las multigramáticas, también me son un poco extrañas. Pero no voy a uno pensar que una especie de convergencia, una gramática que simplemente es más liberal, y entonces en realidad lo que es un efecto de meter reglas más restrictivas, lo que es un efecto de superconjunto, en la cual, por ejemplo, en el caso del orden quechua español, los dos órdenes son posibles porque la gramática no restringe el número de dos órdenes, porque al final del día lo que tiene es un superconjunto de las dos gramáticas base. O en el caso del rendimiento del inglés español, por ejemplo, de las construcciones posesivas o dativas, lo que tenés es menos restricciones porque la gramática es más grande y más chica. No sé si esto es pertinente o no.
Sí, fíjate, podríamos decir eso, pero luego tiene formas por defecto. Por ejemplo, tienes le por defecto, tienes lo incambiable, tienes, o sea, el caso de los órdenes, la verdad es que tampoco son órdenes canónicos, ¿no? O sea, hay múltiples otros órdenes que dependen de la interacción con el estructura informativa. Pero, digamos, lo que nosotros estamos haciendo en esta propuesta es un intento de explicar a un hablante nativo que no es estable. O sea, más allá de la situación de contacto y de la convergencia, creo que el punto central de la propuesta que tenemos, ¿no? Ahora que estamos desarrollando ahora con Roberta y con Mike, es lo que nos presenta un bilingüe o un hablante de herencia, es la gran pregunta de ¿qué hacemos con un hablante nativo, que es nativo porque adquirió esta lengua de los 0 hasta los 4 años, o sea que más nativo no se puede ser, que presenta variabilidad a todos los niveles. Variabilidad entre su interpretación y su producción. Variabilidad en el caso de a veces presentar un rasgo y en un contexto presentar otro, ¿no? Entonces, no es tanto las lenguas como sistemas, sino el individuo que nosotros estamos tratando de aplicar. ¿Qué le pasa a ese individuo? ¿No? ¿Cómo llega ese individuo a tener esta variabilidad interna? Y
porque yo planteo que
por eso sí, ¿cómo perdón?
no, quizás lo que yo estoy sugiriendo es que quizás no sea variabilidad, sino sea mera opcionalidad, ¿no?
Sí, claro, es que tampoco es opcional 100%, porque esa es la otra cosa, que tú ves claramente que para la interpretación tienen una cosa, y para la producción tienen otra. O sea, cuando decimos opcionalidad, para mí no es suficiente, porque la opcionalidad sería puede pasar A o puede pasar B, pero no, pasa A en contexto A, pasa B en contexto B. Y por eso es que es una explicación más de corte psicolingüístico, es decir, yo accedo a cierta representación si tengo tiempo, no estoy estresado, etcétera, etcétera. Y no accedo a ella si estoy estresado, si hay mucha presión sobre mí. Pero eso es algo que nosotros no vemos en un hablante nativo estable. Eso es algo que se ve solamente en la segunda lengua, que van a ser eso ya sabemos de los hablantes. Pero no mentir porque es un hablante nativo.
Claro, eso que vos estás notando no sería esperable si fuera una gramática simplemente un superconjunto, ¿verdad? No generaríamos estabilidad. Ese tipo de gracias, Liliana.
Gracias por la pregunta.
¿Tenemos tiempo para una pregunta más? A ver.
Espera. Espérate un ratito, que estoy buscando. Pero ahorita, yo no sé si estoy compartiendo o no estoy compartiendo. ¿Estoy compartiendo, Pablo?
Está compartiendo, sí.
Ok, entonces voy a buscar. Perdona, espera. Espérate, si lo hago más rápido. Espérate un ratito, que estoy buscando. Pero ahorita, yo no sé si estoy compartiendo o no estoy compartiendo. ¿Estoy compartiendo, Pablo?
Está compartiendo, sí.
Ok, entonces voy a buscar. Ahora no te veo, pero te escucho. Perdona, espera. Espérate, si lo hago más rápido. Espérate un ratito, que estoy buscando. Pero ahorita, yo no sé si estoy compartiendo o no estoy compartiendo. ¿Estoy compartiendo, Pablo?
El slide anterior, sí.
Ok, entonces voy a buscar. Ahora no te veo, pero te escucho. Ok. Perdona, espera. Espérate, si lo hago más rápido. Espérate un ratito, que estoy buscando. Pero ahorita, yo no sé si estoy compartiendo o no estoy compartiendo. ¿Estoy compartiendo, Pablo?
El slide anterior, sí.
Ok, entonces voy a buscar. Ahora no te veo, pero la tarea es que decir si cuando se les preguntaba, ¿no? Por ejemplo, quién quería a Dora que siguiera jugando, ¿no? Si era verdad, por ejemplo, le decíamos, yo estoy cansada y vuelvo para casa, pero tú quédate a jugar un poco más, de acuerdo, gracias, Dora. Entonces, Dora quiere que siga jugando, es verdad, cuando el referente es Boots.
Okay.
O sea, el participante tiene que decir que es verdad.
Okay. Y entonces el resultado para la correferencia, porque esto es ¿cómo se llama?
Disjoint reference, sí, esto es disjoint reference, sí.
¿No? Y the other case is correferential. Existe una diferencia entre de comprensión y producción, pero la tarea es la misma.
No, este solamente era el ejemplo con el disjoint reference. No tengo ejemplo aquí, perdona, para el correferential, pero sería un contexto en el cual tiene que haber correferencia y la persona lo entiende de otra manera, o lo considera falso.
Ok, y es mejor en términos de producción, pero en este caso involucra no financial control, ¿sí o no? ¿Sí? ¿No?
Sí, claro. Lo que quiere decir es que las personas, por ejemplo, pueden decir, cuando es correferencial, pueden decir quiero comer.
Exacto.
Pero cuando escuchan quiero comer, se quedan dudosos.
Sí, que...
Sí, o sea, no saben, cuando no, el 54% es casi chance level, ¿no? O sea, no saben si quiero, o sea, no, cuando juzgan verdad o falso, es chance level.
Oh, very interesting, actually. No era exactamente una pregunta, yo quería entender mejor
sí, claro.
Porque me parece muy interesante que en caso de no financial control, ahí, en la producción, no, la diferencia de comprensión y producción. Entonces, por eso quería volver a entender mejor, porque es muy interesante la diferencia.
Y tienes un punto muy claro ahí, porque, o sea, me gusta mucho que me hayas pedido que aclare esto, porque si te fijas, es la dirección opuesta del subjuntivo.
Exacto.
Sí, o sea, cuando tienes el disjoint reference, interpretan mejor de lo que producen. El subjuntivo es too much work to produce. Pero el control, ¿no? O sea, esta es much easier to produce than to understand.
Sí, lo que me llama mucho la atención es ¿existe algún test estadístico?
Sí, lo hicimos. Sí, para los que tengo en rojo es significativo.
Ok, very interesting. Gracias, Liliana. Era eso.
No, de nada. Y gracias por tu pregunta, porque de hecho, aquí no lo pude presentar, ¿no? Pero una de las razones por las cuales es más fácil producir el infinitivo es porque incluso a veces producen formas muy parecidas a las del inglés. O sea, producen formas como quiero para botas comer, ella quiere para botas irse. Okay. Like he wants for boots to leave.
Okay.
Right? Yeah, and they have those kinds of things they can say. But when they hear Dora quiere irse, right? They're in doubt. Who is leaving? Boots or Dora?
Interesting. Thank you.
Gracias.
Bueno, ¿hay una pregunta más? Bueno, son justo las 5:01, así que te agradecemos mucho la conferencia, la participación. La verdad que fue un gusto para nosotros que pudieras presentar y esperamos verte pronto nuevamente.
Muchas gracias. Y muchas gracias a todos por haber asistido y por tener paciencia con estas locuras. Bueno, muchas gracias. Hasta luego.
Hasta luego. Muchas gracias. Chao.
Chao.
Voy a cerrar acá.